Then we look at a poem called Refuge, and around it, the whole idea of refuge and refugee and finding refuge, home and belonging. So the first poem is not suggested by anyone, suggested by me. The second set around the idea of home and belonging. So right before it begins, we have a poem and a drawing suggested to us by Doka, who's here, then by Robin, who's here, and by someone called Ibtisam, who is with us online. Reclaiming the Land, the subject of that is a short story that I'll give you an extract of. By the way, I'm not assuming that everybody has looked at the text, so there'll be significant extracts from each of the texts, so that gives us a little bit to grab onto. Tunnel Tales is the same as a text, a narrative text. Hopes and Illusions is a text suggested to us by Alice Guthrie, who's going to be with us, hopefully. And then I conclude with some reflections on the ideas of untranslatability and translatability of Gaza and Palestine. So if we look at I mean, all of you might have seen the news of the editor of New York Times Magazine, poetry editor, who resigned. I haven't really had a chance to check the veracity of the news, but the content of it is actually accurate, no matter what's. So this is when she resigned. That's what she said in her letter, and I wanted here to highlight the idea of the limits, the idea of the limitations and the ceiling and the type of language that needs to be adopted when you talk about Gaza or Palestine, the idea of reasonable tones, the idea of certain euphemisms, the idea of verbally sanitized terms and discourse. And obviously she calls it lies in this case. So one key function, I think, of these limitations of discourse is actually to write out, in a sense, a wider narrative or a context, and in this case, the whole concept and the idea of colonization is written out, and we'll give some examples. Another is the famous way of proceeding used by the media that we call balancing, for example. Every time you need someone from the other side to say something. The whole idea of editorial policy across, and that also touches on academia as well, which is the idea that you edit out one narrative and you edit in or write in another one. So this is one way of writing out Gaza in this particular case. Another way or consequence of this is actually writing off Gaza. For example, as you know, the history of it, the way it's located, the way it's policed, is one way of basically making it, in a sense, isolated, disposable, perhaps without consequence, and therefore put not a subject of history, but something that probably will, with time, disappear or find its way into oblivion. So, for example, if you look at the idea, there is the concept of quarantine, which you use here as well, because you isolate and you make barriers, and the Egyptians have their own barriers and the Israelis have their own barriers, and you put this to the side. So one more way of also writing about Gaza is to use it as to use the term as a form of concealment or invisibilizing something else. And by that I mean, for example, you use terms like Gaza conflict or Gaza war, and that, while it visibilizes and shows a certain aspect, is actually, when you use Gaza, you're at the same time invisibilizing Palestine, for example. When you use war, you're invisibilizing the idea of conflict, for example. When you use conflict, you don't historicize it. So this idea we need to keep in mind, and I think it's going to come across for the whole session, this idea of visibilizing, invisibilizing what we hide and what we conceal when we use certain words. So, for example, Ilan Pape has looked at certain terms, and he thought maybe on the long run, some of these terms, he doesn't use them as doesn't talk about them as terms of concealment, but they are, and there's a need to respond to them. So he put them in antonymies. Antinomies. For example, the term occupation, in a sense, hides and should be responded to by the term colonization. The term peace process should be hides something what we call decolonization or anti-colonial struggle, for example. Terms like Israeli defense policy might be hiding ethnic cleansing, for example. And there are many, and I'm sure we all can come up with some. So the basic idea, I think, is to keep this historical perspective and to keep the historical narrative and thinking of what other narrative has been hidden. And most of the narratives that we deal with here, and it tends to be the case, that literature is actually usually hidden. So that's why today we wanted to visibilize literature a little bit, visibilize those who write it, not only as individuals, but also as voices, but individuals is what matter as well, because these in the end the text. So yet, you know, among all of this, the Gaza is not only written out and written off, it also writes. And this seminar, among other things, are places where you have testimonies of that happening. So it serves like a testimony. It's also a recognition that what has been written is very difficult to unwrite. It might be hidden, visibilized, but it can be uncovered and recovered. So while keeping the historical perspective, as you see, even in the choices of texts, I wanted to start with a poem. That poem, I will read it in Arabic for you, and I'll put it out in English. So let's see here. I think I need to admit this person. So that's the poem in Arabic. I have it here. If you wanted to come back later to it, I can return it. So while you have that in English, I'll read it in Arabic. أعيدك في الفروض والاستخارة وأرقي كل مئذنة وحارة من الصاروخ لحظة كان أمرا من الجنرال حتى صار غارة أعيذك والصغار قبيل يهوي تغير بابتسامتها مساره أعيذك والصغار هنا نيام كما نام الفراخ بحضن عشي ولا يمشون للأحلام ليلا لأن الموت نحو البيت يمشي ودمع الأمهات غدا يماما ليتبعهم به في كل نعش أعيذ أبا الصغار وبعد قصف يشد البرج حتى لا يميل يقول للحظة الموت ارحميني فماذا لو تأخرت قليلا يقول لأجلهم أحببت عمري هبيهم مثلهم موتا جميلا أعيذك أن تصابي أو تموتي بعز حصارنا وببطن حوتي شوارعنا تسبح كل قصف وتدعو للمساجد والبيوت فحين القصف يبدأ من شمال ستبدأ من جنوب بالقنوت أعيذك أن تصابي أو تعاني فقد حوطت بالسبع المثاني من الفسفور طعم البرتقال وألوان السحاب من الدخان أعيذك إن من عشق ومات سينقشع الغبار ويضحكان. Now this poem is written by Hiba Abu Nada, whose picture I put here. And Hiba Abu Nada is mostly famous for an important novel that she wrote. It's called Oxygen is Not for the Dead. She's quite well-known female poet, born basically in October, but when on the 10th of this October, 2023, her home was hit and she was killed and she was 32. Okay, so I just put the poem out for you to talk about to this brief moment of paying tribute to her and visibilizing her in a sense. Yeah? I'll go back to the poem. Some of you heard it in Arabic, and I'll put it back in English as well.
Tremendous emphasis on children.
Which are very relevant. This is her, one of her last two poems. So she actually wrote this one on the 10th of October.
It's all, I can't quite remember it all, but it's
Yeah.
throughout the poems. Emphasis on, sorry, tremendous emphasis on children, and throughout the poem, I think it goes on emphasizing the childhood, almost the babyhood and the early youth of those who suffer particularly in these circumstances.
Which is a theme we're going to pick up with the next piece. Such a dominant theme. I mean, there's also this mother-daughter, and we associate the term of refuge and give refuge, or Eidoki, so on, with God, of course. And here, she's doing that kind of protection and giving refuge in that sense. So there is that also throughout. There is this intertexts with the Quran and with the particular practices and so on. It's run throughout. Some of the terms are actually technical. There's a reference, for example, to the longest verses of the Quran, or to verses to forms of prayer and so on. And there's a reference to mosques and so on. So it comes from that kind of sort of verbal and emotional and discursive landscape where you seek refuge at a time where no one else is going to give it to you. And in the end, she herself didn't get that. Okay. So those of you who are not with us, the usual way, if you wanted to intervene, is to actually raise a hand, and we'll have the yellow hand, and we'll see you and let you know. So there are echoes and passageways, as Robin said, between this poem and, of course, the whole fate of children in this situation, not only in Gaza in particular, but also in the news of late, but throughout as well historically. And this is not new. So, so that's why the next piece, which is actually proposed to us by Doka also, who's with us here, I hope it's visible there. So, so I wonder if you can contextualize it to us a little bit.
Right. It started in 2002 when we all became aware that we were preparing for a war, an invasion of Iraq. And I was very angry that people were wearing red poppies while preparing for war. So I started working with poppies and terrible articles in the newspaper of weapons of mass destruction. And then we invaded, and that summer my allotment was full of poppies, and I realized that when the petals dried, they looked like dead skin and blood, dried blood. So I started making mats and doing pieces about the war. And that was the time when the word collateral damage became in everybody's language. And that I found terribly shocking. And we were getting more and more horrendous pictures of children killed by the war. And so I started just trying to work out what to do with these images of dead children, and not sure. And then in 2006, so a few years later, in November, I think it was the 8th or something, a bomb hit a house in Beit Hanun, and the Guardian put a double spread picture of this young woman with 2 small children in a morgue. And this was a double spread picture, and I couldn't throw it away. I didn't know what to do with it, so I put it under the mat that was drying the poppy petals. And somehow the children, it felt almost as though they were breathing and as though the poppy petals were moving. Anyway, I became slightly obsessed with this piece, and that's the piece at the bottom. You can see the woman's face, and then the 2 small children. Yes, and there she is. And I didn't know, I kept on drawing them and thinking about them and drawing them and drawing them. And that's when Walid saw one of the drawings, and he wrote the poem in response to that drawing. It was me trying to make sense of something so unbelievably beautiful, these children and this woman.
So this is the poem by Walid
So the
Khazada.
English poem, yeah, and then a friend, Jean-Charles Paul, he did it in French, but so Walid wrote the poem. Can you read it? I can't read it from here.
It's not very clear there.
Anyway,
Can you read it out? Because
yeah, but I'm very bad at reading out, but I'll do my best. I dream of this place from the little land of non-dreaming, from where your quill brought firebrands into your fingers. There close the eyes and can't slumber. Upon the last of what they saw, there closed the lips, opened a little upon a cry that did not sound, as if they are distracted by the tyranny over them, of the sudden peaceless sleepiness, shaking the little dreamless land. Shaking your finger quill, sister, in no law. So that was from Wellington. I'm most proud about being a sister in no law, I think.
Thank you. We'll hear more about Walid Khaznadar, but I wanted to see if anybody here or in the audience online wanted to comment on this or react to this combination, particularly of the art and painting, knowing that the poem is written by a Palestinian poet with whom we're going to know a little bit more after seeing the drawing and the paint and the construction.
I want to say something. The photographer who took the picture is called Mohamed-Salah, and I hope he's still alive. What am I saying? I don't know what I'm saying. He's from Gaza, and the base and where those children were killed. Oh, he's taken amazing photographs, and yeah, I can't remember what I was going to say. I'm very sorry.
He has I mean the BBC. He does a lot of pictures for the BBC. He's still active and taking quite a bit of
Yeah, I
pictures.
think he's still alive.
So you can actually find him, Mahmoud Hamza, and you'll find all the Hams, and you'll find that's him. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Any comments or reactions? Yes, please.
I have a question. The central image there, Joker, what is that?
That's the child at.
Is that a close-up from the, I'm trying to work out.
So the child at the bottom here.
Yes.
So that's her. And then the only way in the end that I could do it with any sense for me was do it all in poppy petals, because the drawing was too stark and I couldn't.
I remember seeing it was in the church.
What happened to me?
The discussion here is about an exhibition done here in Oxford, where all these constructions were actually
I remember now what I was going to say. I
one
looked
place.
up Mohamed-Salah and just to see again,
Mhm.
and I started looking up articles that were written in the Guardian at that time,
Mhm.
and the language was so powerful and angry, and having that double spread in the Guardian,
Mhm.
compared to the language now,
Mhm.
And I found that very shocking.
Yeah.
And I hadn't expected to see that.
Mhm.
The language has changed.
Actually, the exhibition, I've seen it too, and it's so relevant now as well.
Mm.
It's as if it's happening now, maybe it needs to be revived and.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to this idea of whether it's a repetition or something else. These events that have happened, how should they be conceived towards the conclusion? So then we move to the next poem, which is by Khazandar, and Robin Ostel here. This is the Arabic version. I think Robin is going to read it to us. Then there are two English versions, one a translation and one as a rewriting by an Irish poet, I understand. Okay, all right. So thank you, Robin.
So Walid Khazandar, whose poem in English you just saw as a response to that image, he was born in Gaza in 1950. He is, I would say, absolutely preeminent amongst contemporary Arab poets. He's a great practitioner of what we call in Arabic Qasidat al-Nath, which is normally translated as prose poem. So the poem that I'm just about to read to you, it's quite a short poem, as you see. There is no meter in there, there's no rhyme, in contrast to the poem that Mohamed-Salah read to you as first, with both rhyme and meter in that first one. Just another brief word about Khazandar is that he's always resisted being typecast as the voice of Palestine, in the same way that, say, Mahmoud Darwish was, Mahmoud Darwish, he was Palestine. Khazandar, of course, he doesn't deny his Palestinianness. He's born in Gaza. He has extended family in Gaza. God willing, they may still be alive. But he is an Arab poet. He doesn't want to be totally, as it were, sort of limited and imprisoned just by the Palestinian, as it were, issue. This poem was first published in his first diwan, his first collection. It's called Af'al al-Muda'i, which is Present Acts, published in Beirut in 1986 originally. انتماء. من في غرفتي في خيالي؟ المزهرية ليست في مكانها قليلا، والصورة الفارس القتيل على الجدار مائلة، وأوراقي تضم أطرافها من قراءة سريعة، وليس هكذا أترك قميصي، ليس هكذا أترك مخدتي. من في غرفتي في غيابي؟ أي احتمال، أي هدوء يعيد المسارية إلى مكانها، أي تصالحات تعيد إلى الفارس القتيل هيئته واعتداله في فراغ الجدار. من الذي يعيد إلى مخدتي وقميصي هيئة المرات؟ First English translation. Who was it fractionally moved the vase and was here in the room in my absence, and the picture of the slain knight on the wall? Someone has tampered with it. My papers show disorderly edges from a hurried reading. I never leave my pillow this way, nor the abandon of a soiled shirt. Who was it visited my room with me? With me away, who can it be? What new assertion of calm will restore the vase to its place? What reconciliation impose on the dead knight his old demeanor, his symmetry on the blank wall? What will restore to my pillow and my shirt the aroma of the citizen? Now, the Anglo-Irish poet Tom Forden, who's a very well-known individual, for years he was tutor of English here in Hartford College, but he's much known in poetic and literary circles beyond that. He came across this translation And in his anthology called The Road to Inver, he produced a lot of versions of all sorts of poets, mainly European. So this is d'après Wali Khazindar, as it were. He calls it belongings. Who entered my room when I was out and moved the vase on the mantelpiece just a tad? Who skewed that print? A crusader on the far wall. And those pages loose on my desk. They're a shade dishevelled, aren't they? Of course, someone read them. My pillow's never been dented this way, not by any lovely head. That stray shirt, I'd never leave on the floor. Some shit's dropped it. So who came into my room? Who? Who put the vase back exactly as it was? Who straightened the nailed knight in his corner? Who restored to my shirt and pillow their full rights as citizens of my single room?
Thank you. Yeah, if I can allow myself a comment just on the move between the three, as the Irish poet here sound like a Gazan poet writing today. In a sense, there is an anger, and there is also a response to the disturbance of the normalcy in the home and the intrusion. That seems to me more muted elsewhere in the other versions, but that's just my comment. I don't know. Maybe something Irish going on here, or some kind of connections between the two. Any comments that we have? We have one from Hiba Shazli.
Hey, hello there. Good evening. This immediately came to mind that the room could possibly be Gaza or even Palestine, in the sense that the shirt, the pillow, his belongings are the people, or the sort of this idea of returning full rights as citizens of my single room. So it just sort of struck me right away that he's talking about his home, his an intrusion in his home. Yeah, so, you know, just like you were saying, how certain words at the beginning need to be translated, or they're hidden, there's a hidden meaning. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
It's not quite clear to me. Does Tom, was he translating the English poem, or was he translating the Arabic?
Tom Paulin doesn't know Arabic.
Right, so he was translating an
The
English.
story behind this is that he was ploughing his way to a very big, fat book, an anthology of Palestinian poetry translated into English, and he just focused on this particular poem and then produced his D'après Wali Khazindar, which is in his anthology. It's called The Road to Inver, and there are many poems. Right. His versions of Baudelaire, Rilke, etc., etc. Khazindar is one that he chose. That's this one.
Yes, please.
I have a question. So what's the night? What's mentioned? It's just the night. Is it the night of fairness, or
This, you see, the Arabic says al-Faris al-Qatil, the slain knight. There's a military figure slain. Now, obviously, problem with poetry is that it just has to pull interpretations out of these. These are not public documents, you know. But the whole implication there is that there is there on the wall there's this image of, as it were, a competent slave. Paulin goes the whole hog and calls him a crusader. He doesn't put, it's a crusader, says Paulin, who's been slain. So, you know, Paulin is, after all, I think he would, he has a history, I have to say, of engagement with the whole Palestinian issue, and does not shy away himself, both in what he says and what he writes, from violence and confrontation.
With resonance.
Yes, no, sorry. Oh, go ahead.
With resonance, more towards someone that could have for us here as a sort of Arab.
Yeah, like Shiva.
Yes.
Daniel?
There's something quite striking, and I don't know whether the loaded semantics of it is as present in the Arabic original version as it is in the translation and the reworking of the translation. And is this act of an agency behind the act of restoration, which seems to me to have always been at the center of the voicing and the silencing of Palestine. And I don't want to make that direct association because obviously there's a very complex metaphor and allegory behind all of this. But nonetheless, that question of who's going to restore the ability to look at the traces of the intervention, of the disturbance, and who's going to restore that history. And so that seems to me to have this kind of loaded value.
We have a comment from Mohammed Khdiri and then a comment from Alice online. Go ahead, Mohammed Amin. Unmute yourself. Can he unmute himself?
Hello, can you hear me?
Okay, sure. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I would like to comment on the poem. First of all, thank you for choosing this poem. It exudes a sense of the uncanny. The originally German word unheimlich, this famous essay by Freud, the unheimlich, which is the privative prefix un, negates the home. Unheimlich is the unhomely. So here there is this sense of the negation of the home. Who entered my room? Who moved the vase? There's this thing which becomes l'étranger familier, the strangely familiar, as it was rendered in French. This sense of negation of the home, this eerie juxtapositions. He knows the room, but he, for a moment, ceases to recognize that it is his. Yeah, basically that's the.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Alice Guthrie.
Hey, hi. I was just looking at the Tom Paulin. I mean, I have to give the caveat that I am quite anti these versions by these Western poets who don't speak Arabic. But yet another, as another proof of my point, I don't see where he got the lovely head from. In the Arabic, we've got ليس هكذا أترك مخدتي بس يعني, and he's brought in a lovely head, which I find a bit problematic, to be honest. I don't know what anyone else thinks.
Yes.
Yeah, so I was slightly interested that maybe translation then could be an agent of that disruption. So like in the Paulin one, it's another version of moving things a little bit. So Paulin's also moving things around in the house, which is quite interesting because then it would be, the lovely head would be another kind of tampering. I think that's the only way that I can save the Paulin one in my head. The translation becomes a version of that as well, like a rewriting, which necessarily means disheveling or a kind of disturbance of the surface.
The key is the rewriting.
Yes. Yeah.
Nadia?
I think there's also something just like painfully lost in translation, which is Arabic's use of the possessive particle makes it a lot more resonant. Like to say my room is something, but to say ghurfati, where it's like subsumed into the word and it becomes an article of possession in and of itself. Also, just to go back to the point on translation, intimate, I don't think translates as belongings, which Paulin has titled his piece as such, which I think takes away from that like possession that we see so strongly in the Arabic.
Yeah, and because the space is contested, belonging in the singular becomes more important. Otherwise, you actually justify the multiple belongings of the space to the same. You're actually going. Okay, so I just wanted to make a note to those who are not with us that if you write something on the chat, the people who are in the room here don't actually necessarily see what you're saying. So I also encourage you to comment directly to the room. Okay, so some of these themes, obviously, of home are extended to be the nation, or extended or narrowed, and so on. I don't know if Ibtisam is with us, who suggested the next poem. If she is not, then I'll just put the poem out. So the idea of this poem was suggested to us by one person who's attended last week. And I actually picked it up for a reason, is because Musab Abu Toha, the writer of this poem, was, Ilham is here. Okay, Ilham Isawi. Can you tell us about this poem while we read it?
Yes, yes, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and also especially for confirming that I can read this poem, because it's a striking poem. It's an interesting poem, and the poet himself is very, very interesting. We empathize and sympathize with him and his family in these testing times, and with all those who are, of course, enduring the same experience, and even perhaps harsher. So shall I proceed by reading the poem first, or introducing him first?
Well, if you like, the poem is also here. I mean, if you can hear it, it's also everybody can see it, but if you want to read it, go ahead. It's a short poem. And then the idea is to see what people think about it before we come back to you to sort of wrap up. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay. What is home? What is home? It's the shade of trees on my way to school before they were uprooted. It's my grandparents' black and white wedding photo before the walls crumbled. It's my uncle's prayer rug where dozens of ants slept on wintry nights before it was looted and put in a museum. It's the oven my mother used to bake bread and roast chicken before a bomb reduced our house to ashes. It's the cafe where I watched football matches and played. My child stops me. Can a four-letter word hold all of these?
Thank you. Yes.
I think this is really interesting because it reminds me of something you said about Mahmoud Darwish when we were looking at it last week, and you talked about this kind of inventory style, and it's the kind of same inventory style that we're seeing here as well. And one of the things that was said last week in kind of describing the sense of inventory was it's describing the shadows of shadows. And what's really interesting is that from the Mahmoud Darwish to this one is that here it's actually in the past tense. So we've had this movement from the present to the past as well, which I think seems to kind of speak to the more contemporary moment.
So one aspect is trying to capture really what it is, and then you proceed by inventory of things and see what works and what doesn't work, and trying to capture this idea of how far you can go with the transparency and the metaphors to catch what it is. And then comes that devastating question at the end, of course, and it's again asked by a child, and who stops the adult in his tracks and say, and that word, that four-letter word, obviously in English writing, in English, it can be nation too. It can be a number of other things. It can be home and stood widely as well. And it's left there hanging. You fill it up with whatever, basically. Let's go to Walid bin Khalid, but then I come back to the room. Yeah. So Walid, go ahead, please.
Good evening, everyone. Just a comment. I think, well, it's a beautiful poem. For me, it's very, very cinematic, and it's constantly in motion, and I can visualize all these sequences. It's almost like someone from a remote location sort of telling us this story as a flashback. And I think the construction through almost, yeah, it's very visual construction through short, punchy sequences and using the ellipses to move in from one to another.
Yeah, thank you, Walid. Your line was not great, but I think we got the essence of, and also noted here that certain terms are almost topoi in the Palestinian poetry. This idea of the khubz, of bread in the mother's oven, this idea of the grandfather's rug, which is old, and so on. And we come back to these objects that actually are so important here. Natasha and then Nadi. And then we move on.
Just to build on what Giorgio was saying about the inventory style, it seems that it's also because I think the past tense really gives it this sense of melancholy, that the search for objects or the inventory is a way to somehow hold onto these objects that are disappearing and almost make an image out of them so that they can have something to hold on when there's so much that is being lost all the time.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe.
I think to sort of add to what you're saying, Natasha, this poem I find completely devastating because it's not even the inventory of objects which the poet can no longer possess. It's the implication where when we switch to the present/future at the end of the child, not only is a child a metaphor for life and a new cycle, but I think the question, can a four-letter word hold all of these, implies the child doesn't use the word home. The child has no sense of home or place or belonging, not because of the absence of these things from the child's life, but it seems that the child is also dispossessed of home, not because they don't know their father's home, but because they don't know home at all.
Yeah, that's well seen. So the difference of conceptions of home and memory of home, disassociation between the child and the. Joseph, we'll take the last comment from you, Joe.
Because it's actually because it's two inventories and it's two tenses, because of the it is and then the was.
Yes.
So you get the kind of two incompatible inventories of before and now. And that disjunction is really, that's kind of extremely effective.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Ibtisam, we'll come back to you for a short closing of this discussion before we go to our next text.
Yes, thank you. Ilham is actually.
Ilham, sorry, I keep saying it.
You're welcome. Okay, so basically I chose this poem for a variety of reasons, and well, grosso modo, there are certain images and metaphors that I find very striking. For example, the idea of uprootedness, the idea of trees, whether in terms of belongings, whether in terms of family, whether in terms of nature. So here we can speak about the existential fear, the idea of also eco-devastation, because of course uprootedness here takes us to the story of the over 800,000 olive trees that were uprooted. Also, there's an interesting point an interesting metaphor, especially that of the museum, the rug that's put in a museum. And here we can speak about the fetishization of the occupied by the occupier. This is a very, very compelling, but also devastating image. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Part of
I cry every time.
It's part of the wider plunder that we have, this idea of museums and collecting and so on. Well, thank you very much for sharing this poem with us. Our next text is actually, there are echoes of a tree as well, a really, really important tree. But it comes to us from, and part of what I wanted to do with this seminar is to show really the extent of Gazan literature. It's not only the people who write. By the way, Musab was kidnapped by the IDF. The poem we just read was kidnapped 2 days ago, and Penn wrote, and there was a lot of pressure. He's released today. So the next is by a very well-established Palestinian writer, one of the key Palestinian writers who were born in 1947 with really a dozen novels and short stories and so on. And he left us in 22 and lived since 1948 all his life in Gaza. So I'm going to give you that text, which I have here, and it's by Gharib al-Asqalani. And I hope it's readable. It's on 2 slides, so I'll just be quiet as you read it. It's a bit difficult for me to read the whole thing. I wonder if anybody. Joseph, you want to read? Do you have it? Yes. Okay.
A matter for God, Sheikh Awad. We got work for an Israeli construction company. I worked for a contractor putting in residential pipework along the Ashkelon suburban seashore. David was project engineer. He was quiet and meek, came around first thing to put out the excavation warning signs, and last thing in the day to record the amounts drilled out and to check the measuring holes. No rest for David. His whole being seemed compassionate, smiling as he did at the workers and resenting it whenever a contractor yelled in their direction. The neighborhood stretched far and wide in front of the shrine of Sidi Sheikh Awad. Whenever I talked to my father about the project, it seemed to overshadow everything, and he would bark out, "On your head be it." However, he would quickly relent, recoil into himself, and mutter, "The empty palm can't fight the iron fist." He performed the wudu and profoundly sought his Lord's forgiveness. After the Isha prayer, he asked me, "Has the digging reached the big mulberry tree yet?" The big old mulberry tree stood right on the line we were following, so I nodded. He went over to Mother, his mind made up. We really have to visit the shrine the day after tomorrow. My father slept in the shade of the shrine's wall. Abdullah had headed off for the sea, watching the waves breaking over the naked bodies of the Israeli women, while my mother lit a fire under the cooking pot in order to prepare darisha. At the day's end, the place emptied of its workers. My father surveyed the scene like a hawk. "Come on," he cried, and shot off like an arrow for the mulberry tree, his gut instinct taking hold of him completely. He prayed heavenward and fell to his knees in supplication, both possessed and humble, while Mother stood behind him straight as a spear. Her headscarf drooped around her shoulders, revealing 2 tresses of thick hair around her coal black eyes. She was a girl again at the end of her days. My father stood up and planted his foot at the mulberry tree's trunk. He took 3 steps eastward, then veered 3 steps north. He stood in the middle as if rooted to the spot and called out to me, "Come on, dig over here." I hesitated. What if a contractor walked by? What if one of them informed on us? His voice rose again, even more insistently. "Dig here, boy." He threw himself down and started scrabbling away with his scrawny hands. Anxious, I could see the pulsing in his veins. Then, all of a sudden, you turned up, David. What I feared would happen just had. My terror and misgiving spilled out in one breath. He's my dad and she's my mum. My mother said, "Tell him I came to honor my pledge." I explained this to David. My dad buried something special here 30 years ago and came back today to reclaim it. David was dumbfounded. He stared now at us, now at the mulberry tree, and then ran off to his vehicle. I was sure he was going to do something and feared for my elderly parents. He soon returned with a shovel, however, which he passed to me, saying decisively, "Dig, Mahmoud." The soul gave way to the shovel, and my father's chest rose and fell along with it. The blade then struck something. Father raised his hand and cautiously removed the soil with his hand until what he had buried there appeared to him once again. My mother's tears streamed down her face while David stood transfixed. My father took out a small earthenware pot, hugged it to his chest, and leaned his back against the trunk of the tree. David approached, trying to take it from him, but father tightened his grip while mother shrewdly stood between the 2 of them, silently urging my brother and me to do the same.
Thank you very much, Joe. Brilliant. Thank you. There's a lot there, but can I just, for those who have not read beyond this, can I ask what's your guess about what he was digging out? Keys? That's a very good guess. Keys? Any other thoughts?
Letters?
Letters? pictures. It's true. All of this and more. So he was digging up a key. He was digging up his marriage photos, and he was digging up as well the deeds that he owned the land. And that's why I chose this story for you. And I thought these paragraphs, we don't need to read the whole story. In that sense, they're really, I think, very dense and very evocative, and clearly come from a very skilled writer as well. So over to you. The trees, everything, and I revealed the end, but there's a lot to be revealed. And so David character, interesting character who has a connection with the boy, with the son, but no connection with the father. And obviously this land exists across the border from Gaza. It's now in one of the kibbutz, in one of the settlements lands. So they go to work on their own land that is no longer home, that is no longer their land, but buried things there. And there's a trope, as you know, in Palestinian literature about the stuff that you keep in the keys and things buried and you need to uncover. I mean, the text itself is a reclaiming. The text itself is a way of marking that absence by talking about the hidden, the uncovered, making claims to the land and staking hold on it while no longer holding it. And I think this father-son is very interesting. Why do you think we have Hiba has thought already? Go ahead, Hiba Shelti.
Shukran. The line, the empty palm can't fight the iron fist.
Yeah.
Very interesting. The father saying that. And then interesting also in the second page is that David immediately wants to take what the father has dug out.
Yes. Yeah. And obviously David would be instrumental because he actually would go and bring the shovel and so on. And then the rest of the story is that the father will take the contents and gives the box to David, and he said, I hope you can store valuable things, valuable to you in this particular box. Really, really interesting. Let me go to this. Some of you may remember Iron Fist. Wasn't that one of the attacks? Yeah. Wasn't it used in the Persian Gulf War? I think the Iron Fist. And this statement is obviously that the weak cannot really fight the strong, and that's in that sense. And using this image of the palm tree. But I also wanted to mention the mulberry tree. Is anybody Palestinian can tell us about Shajarat al-Tut? If there's any, I mean, all of us also in North Africa and other places grew up with the idea of the tut, the mulberry tree. And usually it's also a playground for the kids. And you never know when it was actually planted, and you never know what's going to die. It's completely eternal. It's always there. And you recognize neighborhoods by the distance from the mulberry tree. It's near the mulberry tree, it's far from the mulberry tree, on the left of the mulberry tree. Shajarat al-Tut. He is not using olives, using palm trees as a metaphor, but also the mulberry tree being rooted. And he is sure that it's going to be there, and his treasure is actually safe with the mulberry tree. So entrusted it to it, becomes an equivalent to the land, comes until, of course, it's going to be bulldozed and probably some modern building will emerge from it and be uprooted again, like the poem before it that was suggested to us. Any other thoughts about this text from here online, Joe?
He becomes equivalent to the tree as well. Like there's a pattern of imagery of him planting his foot, rooted to the spot. The sense of kind of genealogy. Yeah. He is the mulberry tree of his family.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, nicely seen. And obviously this is near a shrine, and that's also important. Even ethnographically in this story, that particular shrine is important, and it's also the place where you go and celebrate. And it happens this time on the wrong side as well. So even that kind of, yeah.
Can you clarify the telling them I came to honor my pledge? I don't quite understand.
Say that again?
Tell them I came to honor my pledge.
Oh,
Do you know what's you trying to say there? I don't quite understand how that.
yeah, I think the pledge seems to me is to actually find the treasure, find the deeds, and uncover them. Yeah, we'll have one quick comment and one from you, and then we move to the next text.
It seems to me, I mean, I don't know what they're kind of doing, very looking at technology, but they seem to be very human in a way, because they shed this red, useful fruit and crops to the ground. It feels very living,
Yeah.
This has, whether this text has been written in Arabic and translated?
Yes, yeah, he writes, I think, exclusively in Arabic. He's been translated to Arabic, Spanish, Russian, a number of languages. I don't have the Arabic one. Yeah. Nadia will take a last comment. And then
just to answer the pledge question, I read it also as you can't fight with an empty fist. So maybe with the deed and the key in his hand, he didn't fight the fight to retain the honor of the spirit land, etc., etc.
Yeah. Okay, so we are a number of themes, as you know, will emerge here as well, but in a very different way with the next text. And the text was proposed to us by Alice Guthrie, who's with us. And I have, Alice suggested 3 paragraphs. I reduced them to 2. And I think they're readable from a distance. But Alice, could you just begin briefly, just how do you want us to know before we read, and then we'll read and follow the same. Are you with us, Alice?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
About the story first, or about
I know what you want us to know before we actually look at the text, and then you can come back later to sort of gaps.
Well, before you look at the text, we're in the middle or maybe 3/4 of the way through, and huge amounts of talking and reaction are happening all over. This is set in Jabalia, where he's from, and huge amounts of reaction are happening all over the camp to the idea that the character Darwish, this is a fiction, obviously, has won the lottery. So we're just dropping into the middle of that. It's all got quite out of hand by this point. I think that's all you need to know, actually.
Okay, so all right, thank you.
Sorry, I should say one more thing, actually. Where we jump in right now is in the voice of a police officer who's thinking about the fact that this has happened. So a police officer is out kind of on duty because so many huge crowds have surrounded Darwish's house in reaction to this news. And this is the kind of the police officer's thoughts that we start with now.
Okay. Do we need to read the text out loud, or should we just keep it? Huh?
Yeah.
Alice, would you read it? Hold on. Or you want someone else to read it?
I can read it. Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure, I can read it. I wrote it.
Okay, that's great.
In reality, things didn't generally land at Darwish's feet. On the contrary, it could be said that he didn't really have very much luck in life at all. So if it was true about Darwish winning the lottery, what the officer had said to the chief of police would be completely accurate. Here he was winning the lottery and finally reaching out his arms to embrace the luck that had been hidden by such dark clouds and had come to him so late. But no matter, it had finally come. The policeman said to himself that Darwish's life had certainly been tough, no doubt about it, but luck had smiled on him in the end, whereas other people's lives carried on being tough all the way through, without luck's frowning face ever so much as twitching a muscle. Some people died having known only misery and pain. Pain was an eternal companion to the inhabitants of the camp. But luck hadn't just smiled on Darwish, it had thrown its head back and laughed. As the policeman allowed his attention to get drawn back into the crowd surrounding him, he chuckled to himself at the vicissitudes of that weird old creature, fate. Then there was another influx of reporters and journalists into Big Street. People's mobiles started to ring out of the blue, and when they answered, they'd find a news agency on the line looking for an eyewitness report from the scene. The reporters surpassed themselves at presenting the situation in the camp as a game changer. Suddenly, this small neighborhood had become the center of the universe, the heart of the action in the hottest item on the news. Oh, we're going on. In the middle of all this were the men who lived closest to Darwish. They stood around his front door as if they'd convened a committee to settle on a definitive position about what was happening. All of this took place before Darwish got back. His son and daughter were at home, and they were alarmed by the size of the crowd. The boy stood at the window, peeping out at the street through the slats of the shutter, and the girl sat with a group of women from the neighborhood who'd been drawn there, like the men, by the news they'd heard. They were all here because they suddenly wanted her as a bride for their sons. Each one talked about how her son had been infatuated with the girl since she was a child, and then they all began to tell stories of their son's abiding love for her over all these years. Then they each went on to describe their son and the shining future that lay ahead of him. Darwish's daughter had never heard such incredible love stories before, and she'd never had the slightest inkling of all this passion and longing for her. But suddenly, these young men were all coming out of the woodwork, and according to their mothers, their infatuation with her was self-evident. She hadn't finished her second year at university, so it was still early for her to be thinking about getting married. She wanted to continue her studies. That had been her mother's dream. The women smiled at her and made a long engagement sound perfectly easy. One of them told her, "My boy would wait 1,000,000 years for you," and they all laughed at each other for exaggerating as they vied to convince the young woman that their son was Mr. Right.
Thank you, Alice. I wonder if you could resist a little bit asking Alice about translation until a bit later, because it's not every day that we have a translator. I think translation runs through a little bit and was prepared for. So we'll come back to you, Alice, about this. But let's see, I wonder if people have any reactions or thoughts about this particular text. Or I see Mahmoud Amin. Go ahead, Mahmoud. Unmute yourself, please.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Actually, I would like to thank Professor Alice for suggesting this text. I have read it earlier, and you know, the protagonist Darwish reminded me, of course, of Mahmoud Darwish, in the sense that 50 years ago he wrote this famous poem about Gaza, for the silence of Gaza, in which he says that we do injustice to Gaza when we mythologize Gaza, when we turn it simply into a myth. And here the greatness of this piece of writing is that it demythologizes in a way, because Gaza, I think, is tragically caught between the hammer and the anvil, in the sense that the hammer of dehumanization, you know, human animals from its enemies, from the occupiers, and the anvil of mythologization, glorification on the part of their supporters. But Gaza is neither. Yes, the resilience of its people is mythical. Their steadfastness deserves glorification. Yet the people of Gaza also merit to be portrayed in their multifaceted human complexity, as it were. So they are humans after all. I mean, I have read all the piece. They are inhabited by emotions and affects of envy, desire, greed, resentment, when their neighbor is presumed to have won the lottery, you know, disgust, tama, greed, you know, all those conflicting human desires which are denied Gaza people because of their intensive reduction into victims, resistance, etc. So in a way, this text rehumanizes, as it were, the people of Gaza, and they're simply humans, like all of us, hence the persistence and relevance of the slogan. They're not just numbers, you know, they're not statistics, they have stories to tell, they have dreams, they have lives.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you.
Yes, and that's, I think, what literature does, and that's why we focus on literature, the human side. Any other comments or? Yes, please.
Well, I thought, if you close your eyes, you could have thought you were listening to Jane Austen. I mean, it was, the comedy, I suppose, of the, you know, suddenly someone's got some extraordinary sort of windfall, and then everybody is buzzing around that person, like sort of, there's a honeypot, you know. And I thought that was sort of quite interesting, but it was also interesting to me because I personally didn't I mean, I don't know the liberties that Alice took in the translation. I know you didn't want to talk about it, but you know, I just didn't imagine that sort of comedy in this particular scenario. I think.
Yeah, thank you. It's not that I didn't want to talk about translation. In fact, I will close on untranslatability and translatability of Gaza. So translation is at the heart of it. And actually, I have a direct, Alice, if you have anything to add, and then if you could entertain my question as well, is this question of you sitting down to translate, and not only translate this text, but translate everything as you translate this text. How would you work? But I wonder if you could tell us more about the text before that.
Sure. You have got actually the Arabic text, but because I didn't attach it when I first emailed it. I don't think it's in the folder yet, but it should go in the folder so that you can have. Sorry, I didn't get the name of the person who made the last comment, but you'll be able to have a look and see whether you think I took liberties or whether you think it's all there. But yeah, I think he's an amazing writer, Etif, and he's still alive right now. Bless his heart. And he's in Gaza. He lives in Ramallah, but he's in Gaza with his 15-year-old son. They're both still alive, but his whole inner circle of friends pretty much are dead right now in the recent weeks. And yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you want me to say about the story, I guess?
No, yeah, any final comment really, because you want to move on.
Yeah, you haven't got much time. I guess the thing that I find really, really amazing about his work, and I would urge you to read more of it, those that haven't, and this is an exemplary, a great example, I guess, this piece, is that he'll take something and he'll use it as an amazing kind of lens to refract something through. So there's a spoiler that I won't give. There's a great payoff at the end of the story about the lottery, but he takes the idea of the lottery and then uses it as a lens to put all this other stuff through. So you get like the Islamist groups, and you get the rumor mill, and you get like people's impoverished expectations, and you get the way that if people are held in an open air prison, they're going to compete with each other. But you also get like strong community, and there's so much that comes through. Yeah, and it's funny, and a lot of what he does is about what's it like to live in Gaza when there's this sort of international attention and ignoring, and what does that do? What's the distortion of that? And so the idea that the news cameras come swooping in and their phones are ringing, you know, but they're not really being seen. They're being kind of overexposed and not seen or something, which is something that I think he does.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, there's an entire politics and dynamic as well. But I'll do the spoiler, Alice. Actually, we realize there's no lottery in Gaza altogether. So thank you very much for suggesting this to us and for translating it as well. So the next text, the last text before I actually conclude, takes us to the idea of tunnels. I mean, we hear about tunnels all the time, and I thought, oh, this kind of some kind of social history of tunnels, some kind of way, tales of tunnels, or retelling them and giving us a view of them. And there's quite a bit of humor there as well. So we look at this text, two extracts from it, and it's Tunnels, Love Lines and Absurdities by Khaled Haroub, who some of you would know. And again, do you want this read or prefer to have it? You can see it, right? Well, I can't read it myself. I prefer a faster reader.
Tunnels, Love, Lions, and Absurdities. I saw her emerging from the far dusky light, walking as quickly as her heavy burden would allow her. She was overstrained with a child resting on her arm and neck, a rucksack thrown on her back, and a tight grip on the hand of another child walking fast in front of her. Thick darkness would fill the narrow and low spaces of the tunnel behind and surrounding her body, giving her face and the faces of her children brighter contrast. They looked luminescently white, and I thought I must look white as well. Our tunnel was classified as a VIP line because people could walk through it at full height, without bending, let alone crawling. The Gaza tunnels used to have a scale of prices, moving up in cost according to the length, height, and walkability of each of them. Crawling, long distance, and low ceiling tunnels were the cheapest option. Sliding tunnels had a middle scale price, as you would be put onto a big piece of hard rubber, usually a second-hand tire, and somebody would pull you to the other end. In height and distance, they were relatively better than the crawling type. The VIP tunnels are the really luxurious ones. You could walk heads up and enjoy a shorter distance.
Hold on, there's more. There is more.
Or perhaps those desert brides had not heard of Musa, the Chinese young man who fell in love with Iman from Dir al-Balah. They met while Musa, who had mastered Arabic, was accompanying some journalists as a translator in Gaza. Working together for a short period of time was enough for Cupid to softly release his arrows into the two young hearts. They stayed in touch after Musa's departure. The love story heated up, leading the couple to vow to meet again and marry. Months later, the Chinese lover traveled back to Egypt, but he was denied entry by the Rafah crossing. He spent some days lingering around, then managed to arrange a tunnel journey for himself, all the way from Xinjiang in North China to this obscure spot on the world's map called the Gaza Strip. And finally, against all odds, Musa stood tall in front of Iman's father, asking for her hand. A Palestinian father who never thought of accepting a non-Palestinian man to marry his daughter now yielded before the brave demand of this determined man and the boldness of his daughter. He gave them a big yes. Musa and Iman became a couple. Later on, Iman officially declared that after weeks of training, she was able to use chopsticks to eat the tasty Chinese food made for her by Musa.
And if people are looking for evidence that tunnels actually exist, there it is. So yeah, over to you. Do you have any comments or thoughts on this particular text? It's not a fictional text. It's like a autofiction or something. So the writer actually made the journey and then talked about it. Oh, it's just I think it's maybe 7 pages or 8 pages, and it's in the reading. It's in the reading, so you could look at all the other stories it includes there, including smuggling a lion for the zoo through the tunnels. Yeah, it's quite a social history of the tunnels. Yeah.
I think this gives great joy to know that there is all this like hilarity and ridiculousness happening at all times, despite the impossible conditions under which people in Gaza live. I think the idea that someone from Xinjiang in North China made it into Gaza through the tunnel is like this wonderful narrative of what it is to go from quote freedom to unfreedom, but for love, and the dimension that that plays in the narrative in the Arabic literary canon of like the Arabic man as the ultimate lover. He's like so obsessed and so intense about his love, and yet this man is not Arab, and so it's interesting to see how he plays into that dynamic. And his name is Musa.
Well, in order to marry a Muslim woman, you have to convert. There is the story of a Russian woman who comes smuggled in as well.
But just a slightly more serious point. I mean, the way the tunnels in Gaza are portrayed, it's as though they're purely a nefarious military infrastructure, which, you know, the point is that the tunnels in and around Gaza exist so that normal life can often go on. You know, smuggling is a fact of life, because without smuggling, life would be even worse, and so on and so forth. It's also a security measure for the inhabitants of Gaza, who could lose their lives at any moment walking in normal streets.
So with the blockade also on the Egyptian side, obviously.
Yeah.
So if you have the land completely surveyed and policed, and you have the sky completely surveyed and policed, the only place is the underground, so to speak. So it was part of the economy, and these particular ones are obviously on the Egyptian side before they were closed in 2015, I think by Sisi in that sense. And yeah, in the story they're so classified in different parts, including the resistance tunnels in a variety of tunnels. So it's this living underground, or what is home again, and pathways to it and out of it and so on, that it's land and sea. You don't have them, like we read last time. Where do we go after the last sky when everything is closed? In this case, you go underground. In next week, you leave or you're chased out, as we will see when we deal with the diaspora. Okay, if we don't have any burning comments, we just go to basically some, and I promised that we'll go back to untranslatability and translatability. And it's within the context of visibility and invisibility, and what you choose to show and what you choose to conceal in that sense. So which we started with at the very beginning, and literature responds to this. So this idea of the limitations and limits set, for example, on talking and writing about Gaza and Palestine in the media and academia and public sphere and so on, impeding, curtailing, some places, in instances, making it even illegal, actually, form of use. You cannot use a transparent language. You can't use the straight language to recall. You have to use a certain language, and obviously we all have seen many examples. So this area, this flight is judged as something you shouldn't translate, and this is the understanding of untranslatable here, as in forbidden to be translated in that sense. So last week we saw this poem, and I wanted to look here at translation across time and space. Last week we saw a poem that translates what happens in Gaza, for example, across time. So it translates 36 into 1948, 1948, 67, 2003, and so on, and the years before. So there's a translatability that the Palestinians have by actually taking a time to refer to the other one as a foundation, so on, not necessarily in a repetition, and that's an interesting way of looking at it, not a repetition, a repetition, as I will say in a minute. So we saw that, but as a form of, if you like, a process or a strategy on the part of the occupier, but also on the part of the resistance, so to speak. You recall these as leading somewhere in that sense. So across space, we also saw some of the stories last week, how, for example, Deir Yassin and Kafar Qasim, these massacres and landmarks are translated into Jenin, for example, or Gaza and so on. They talk about it in the same way. So, but they're all linked in the Palestinian mind by the same thing, which we could call the fact of colonization. It runs through them. From the outside point of view, they should be delinked. They're separate events. They're different. They don't lead to each other. What's happened in Gaza in 2003 is not a Nakba, is not a 1948. No, it shouldn't be looked at. Whereas if you put the fact of the whole historical narrative, then you see the linkages. So, and literature tries to make them visible through these translations. So if we take Selma de Berg, for example, who's Anglo-Palestinian writer who's not from Gaza, when she wrote a novel out of it, which is based in Gaza, she said that she took all her knowledge about Gaza from what happened in Jenin, for example. So she translated Jenin into Gaza, and then later when she did book launches and things like that, people didn't say that's Jenin, they said that's Gaza in that sense. So she did that kind of translation, if you like. So here the sort of, and if we take more recent times, and I wanted to close with that one, is that Fadi Jouda, who is a well-known poet, Palestinian poet who writes in English and maintains a good blog and does translations. To speak about translation, he thought about making a free translation of a couple of lines by Mahmoud Darwish. And last time I mentioned that for Mahmoud Darwish, something he talks about all the time that Rome is not Rome and London is not London for me. The present is not the present, because when I'm in Rome, I'm going to remember my friend who was assassinated in Rome. When I'm in London, I can't see London without seeing, another assassination or another. So the place is not. He takes some of that, and Derwish wrote an elegy to his friend who was assassinated in Rome, which I mentioned last week. And he makes a very interesting substitution that I wanted us to look at. So if we look at Derwish first. So Derwish writes, قم اقرأ. He صباح الورد يا ماجد صباح الورد قم اقرأ سورة العائد وشد القيد على بلد حملناه كوشم اليد صباح الخير يا ماجد صباح الخير والأبيض قم اشرب قهوتي وانهض فإن جنازتي وصلت. By the way, Surah Al-A'id doesn't exist in the Quran. It's Surah of the returnee. And obviously this leads us directly to what we'll be discussing next week, the idea of the right of return, the idea exactly. So what Fuda said, he said, he didn't mention it exactly in this way, but he took Majid out and put Gaza in a translation of this poem. And this is what his poem emerged as. And with that, I leave you. We will return next week. And thank you all, and thank you for those who are following us from a distance as well. And thank you all for being in the room. Thank you.